Design Perspective series. And Joseph White, are you on the call?
I'm here.
Okay, perfect. Well, welcome everyone. This is our Design Perspective series on all things related to design. We're going to be talking about some of our research and insights, and Joseph White is our guest speaker, subject matter expert this month, and Joseph is Director of Design Strategy with MillerKnoll. This is actually a two-part presentation. We were with you before the holidays. Hopefully, you were all able to join. And that was MillerKnoll's current point of view on future of work. This will be part two, which is more of a forward-looking point of view on the future of work. So Joseph is going to share that information with you in the presentation, and then we're going to have a facilitated Q&A at the end of the session. So we'll encourage you to put your questions in the chat field. I'll monitor those and then give those to Joseph after the presentation. But if you do have questions throughout the course of the presentation, please do add them to the chat feature. So Joseph, I'll hand it over to you to plunge right in.
Thanks, Alan, and thank you everyone for joining online, wherever you're dialing in from. So as Alan was saying, this is part two of a series, and I will do a bit of a brief recap of some of the insights from part one if you missed that, but they're also just important to set the context for what we're going to spend more time reviewing today. So this is, I'm actually really excited to have this opportunity to share with you today. I would say 9 times out of 10, I am forced through the filter of keep it simple. So today I'm going to ignore that rule, and I'm going to present a very broad range of information. And the breadth there is really important because that really will give you a sense of the foundation of knowledge that we as MillerKnoll are building upon. And this, deep belief that the broader that foundation, the higher that foundation, the greater our depth of field. So when we engage in, looking to the future, trying to anticipate what's coming next, the more that we know really enables and helps to sharpen that focus. So this really is going to be more of a deep dive conversation on both some of the legacy research that forms that foundation, as well as some current and forward-looking projects that we have on the books. I'm not going to touch on everything, just the hits, the highlights, if you will. And we're going to include several links in the chat along the way where you can dig in for more information. But as Alan mentioned, as questions come along, please drop those in the chat and we'll dive into as many as we can along the way. I wanted to also acknowledge I was going back and reviewing the invite for this session, and it said that I was going to reveal some insights and explain what it all means for the future. I wish I knew what it all meant for the future, but what I can tell you is that this body of knowledge gives me tremendous confidence in knowing that as a place design practitioner, as I know many of you on the call are as well, that we have a lot of great information to work with when it comes to managing and facilitating the relationship between people and the places they create for themselves. And this is a huge opportunity for us to engage in that active place creation in a much more intentional way and engage more people in the process for more inclusive outcomes. So without further ado, we're going to continue on and take a look at some of the context that was shared from the previous part one of this series. And really, it's acknowledging that our relationship with work and the workplace have changed forever. I don't want to gloss over that statement because there's a tremendous amount of focus in market and public dialogue today around a returning to the office. And you'll see that phrase return to office it's probably going to pop up at some point over the next hour. But really what we want to do is focus more attention on looking forward to the future of work, looking beyond where we've been in the past and start to build more proactive approaches going forward. So to really kick things off and set the context for this need of looking forward, we want to acknowledge how incredibly uncertain our world is, and that's only going to increase. This report is referred to as the World Uncertainty Index, and it's a report that's synthesized from the economic reports of 143 individual countries. It's something that's done by The Economist out of the UK. And what it's doing is it's tracking the number of times that the word uncertain or some variation of that word, like uncertainty, shows up in those reports. And what you can see is that uncertainty is both increasing and becoming more erratic and interconnected globally. Something that happens all the way on the other side of the world can have immediate impact within days, if not sooner, in your local context. So what that means is that we need more flexible solutions that allow organizations that span across those areas to respond to local conditions while still remaining true to the purpose and objectives of that broader organization. And I'll speak more to that idea a little bit later. So another point on flexibility is that we know workers want an unprecedented level of flexibility. This is a great thing. And that flexibility plays out both in where they want to work and when they want to work. And we can see that from these stats that workers that have a high degree of flexibility are reporting that they feel more productive and feel that they have a greater ability to focus. So this is a really great thing. There's an opportunity here, though, and that these are self-reported statistics on performance and productivity. We've seen a lot of, and heard a lot of recent, I would say, counterpoint executive sentiment statements saying that productivity is lower. I would dare say that a lot of those statements are also based on feelings and beliefs as opposed to objective data. So here's an opportunity for executive leaders within organizations and workers to come together and have a real conversation about what are some true measures of success going forward. And that being one of the most, I would say, key drivers to informing a more intentional approach to place design when you think of place as a tool for helping people achieve their objectives. If those objectives and how they're going to be measured aren't clear, you end up with some of this, I would say, unnecessary heightened rhetoric that we're seeing in the market around this like artificial sense of a battle, between these two entities coming together and building more of a state of the future that we want. I should also acknowledge that the data on this slide comes from Future Forum. MillerKnoll is a founding partner of Future Forum, along with Boston Consulting Group, Management Leadership for Tomorrow, and Slack. And that group basically administers a quarterly pulse survey to over 10,000 desk-based workers in Australia, France, Germany, Japan, the UK, and the United States. It's important that this is quarterly because we're in such a fluid state where things are changing around the world rapidly. People's expectations are changing rapidly. And so this data set really helps us keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening. We use that data to then engage with executives to understand what's happening in real time within their organization and what sort of strategies are being implemented, what sort of learnings and best practices are emerging. So I think a link is being dropped into the chat where you can always connect to the latest round of research. There are also other resources on that site around playbooks and best practices from things that we've uncovered over the couple of years that this organization has been in existence. The next round of Future Forum Pulse data is going to go live on the 17th of February, and that will be our winter Pulse report. All right. So we know that people want flexibility. At MillerKnoll, we wanted to do just a really quick survey to get a sense of what impacts people's decisions not to come into the office. And this was really a pretty interesting exercise in learning that right up at the top of the list were commute and well-being. So when you're asking people to come into a workplace, it's got to be worth their while. It's not going to be something that is just a default. And what we're seeing here is that people have really started to understand the true cost of commute in terms of time out of their day and expenses to commute. And also the well-being costs that can be associated with showing up in an environment that hasn't been designed to support your mental, physical, or emotional well-being. Some of the other key things here, and this is also going to show up in future conversations around inclusive design, is looking at the role of someone who may be a primary caregiver in an organization. And one of the things that's interesting about this is I think that previously in a lot of workplace strategy programs, organizations were starting to identify personas. And I think that's a very useful tool. But the personas were more often than not developed around a functional job role. So is this person in finance? Is this person in marketing? And if they were adding an additional layer of information, it might be looking at that worker's mobility profile. Are they assigned to a desk? Are they a mobile worker? But there is a critical piece of information there, and that information is coming from the outside context of that worker's life. So if someone is a primary caregiver within their family unit, they're going to have a different set of needs and expectations when they show up at the office than someone who has exactly the same functional role within the organization, but lives alone and lives a very short distance from the office. So finding ways to capture some of those really important characteristics of an individual worker and what their needs are when they show up in order to be successful. So the counterpoint to that is what draws people into the office. And this data is coming from the Future Forum Pulse as well. And what you can see is that far and away, the top driver is people seeking collaboration and camaraderie. So the high stats there are really about seeking those interactions for face-to-face, in-person, in-the-moment interaction. And so that really starts to tip us off that we need to look at the balance of spaces that's being allocated for within places and create many more of those going forward. Overarching all of this is this idea of social connection and broader social health. This stat coming from BetterUp, which is a virtual coaching and mentorship platform, and their head of behavioral research, Dr. Kristin Leimgruber, shared this stat that people with low social connection are 70% more likely to feel burnout than people with high social connection. This is an incredibly fascinating topic and something that we're digging into much more right now. And we have additional projects on the boards in the not too distant future looking into social networks and social health. I'm going to speak a little bit more about one of those here in a few moments. But if you want some more information on this, you can check out the MillerKnoll Looking Forward podcast, season 2, episode 1, with Dr. Kristin Leimgruber, and she'll share some more insights around this topic. So the last part of part 1 was really taking that information and presenting a new typology of spaces. And so the motivation for this spaces was really this typology was around these shifts in expectations. And I would say that previously, many of the best workplaces were designed with an activity-based approach. And that's still a very useful approach, but we're seeing a subtle shift with increased focus on the value of relationships and experiences at work. So this typology of spaces is really primarily structured by the level of social interaction or social experience that people are seeking within an environment, whether that's at an individual, group, or community level. And then the second layer of that is once you identify that level of social interaction, what's the nature of the interaction? What is it that people are actually trying to do? And this really looks at bucketing activity into 2 really high-level groups. On one hand, you have actions that are more open-ended, that are more about exchanging ideas, reflecting upon ideas, And then on the other, you have actions that are much more production oriented. They're intended to produce some sort of tangible or specific result. And that starts to set up an interesting dynamic. When you look at the things that people are seeking to do, adequate support starts to look a little bit different. And one of the key things that we're looking to facilitate this dialogue is through visual examples, to be able to present like, is it this or is it that? And so when we talk about communities at work, we can look at, and these are just one example of hundreds of different types of environments that could roll up within these categories. But are you bringing a community together for socialization and open-ended exchange, like in the environment you see on the left? Or are you bringing a community of folks to come together and get things done, something that's more targeted towards production in that space on the right? And that thinking applies across the social scales, looking at spaces for groups, whether they're primarily coming together to exchange and reflect upon ideas, or if they're actually coming together to collaborate and build those ideas and document them. And then lastly, looking at the individual state as well, from that stat that I shared earlier around perceived negative impacts to well-being as being a barrier to coming into the office. What we see here on this slide are some new ways of thinking about creating space for individuals at work, whether that's moments for quick reflection and respite, as illustrated on the left, or new types of environments that are really intended to cultivate true individual focus, like this study hall or alone together type environment that you see on the right. So that was a really quick overview of part one of what was shared in this series. And we'll be dropping a link in the chat if it hasn't popped up already to that series if you want to go into more of a deeper dive on the ideas that were shared there. So now I'm going to pause really quickly and take a drink of water. Because now this is the beginning of part two for sure. So looking forward, our foundation of knowledge enables constructive exploration. And so what I mean by that is that looking at both the research and expertise legacies of Herman Miller, of Knoll, of our broader collection of brands, when we put all of that information together, it gives us a really solid foundation of the things that we know about the relationship between people and the places they create for themselves. It also gives us a clue to things that we want to know more about in the future going forward. So, to help places deliver on their potential, we've really taken this opportunity to synthesize the research and expertise of Miller, of Knoll, the broader collection of brands into a set of 4 place design principles. And those place design principles serve a number of different roles. But first and foremost, it's really about working to create places that matter. And there's a key thing to highlight here around this notion of places that matter. We at MillerKnoll certainly cannot determine the value of a place. That value is really only determined by the people who use it. So we can help facilitate conversations to identify some of those things, but really that articulation of value has to come from the users. And those of you in the A&D profession know this so well. That's exactly what you do on a day-to-day basis. So while much of the research and practice that informed these principles originated from the realm of workplace, the core mechanics and emotions that connect people to place are universal, regardless of place type. So we really view these as a way to talk not only about workplace, but also to talk about residential environments, healthcare environments, education environments, and really targeting on that kind of fundamental state of the human condition in the built environment. And these principles not only draw upon insight gained over decades, but they're also designed to guide our exploration into the future. Collectively, they function as a place design toolkit, if you will, communicating what we believe, backed by what we know, and in relation to things that we can help people do. that three-tier structure really closely relates to Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive levels, which is a model for structuring learning objectives. For those of you that want more of like a nerdy deep dive behind some of this, but that idea of belief really being backed by foundational knowledge and connected to plans for action is something that's really important here, because it's one thing to pontificate and think about all of the interesting things, but if you don't put them into action, that's really a bunch of wasted effort. And our goal here is really to push forward and create new types of environments that yield better experiences for people and ultimately make a more positive impact on society. So these principles really serve as a set of hypotheses to be tested and refined over time. And as the world changes, we learn more and more knowledge is gained and more is added to our toolkit. So today I'm going to share some of that foundational knowledge that we've already accepted, and then just give some examples of some of the things that are bubbling up that we are looking to add to that toolkit in the future. So principle one is places that matter start with people. How and even why we design places today is different than it was 10, 5, or even 2 years ago, yet this fundamental principle remains true. Places that matter start with people. Understanding how people experience the world is a prerequisite for creating places that matter. And that's because everything valuable about a place, its beauty, its function, its feeling, is conferred by the people in it. And just because human perspective is subjective, that doesn't mean it can't be explained, understood, and recognized as a source of meaning. So a key insight with this principle is that people show up simultaneously as individuals, members of groups, and representatives of larger communities. As they move throughout their day, different experiences at the individual, group, and community level will take precedent depending on what needs to be done. So these variable roles that people fill have an impact on what they value most in a place, whether that's being able to gracefully host others or facilitate dialogue amongst a defined group of people, or effectively tune out distractions on their own. So that understanding of human experience is really key as a starting point in engaging in the act of place design. So this principle focuses on human experience in general. And these are some of the key topic areas that roll up underneath this. And so that belief of places that matter start with people is backed by things that we know in these topic areas. When we look at human experience, acknowledging that people simultaneously experience the world physically, cognitively, and socially for a more holistic kind of view, at that physical lens level, really looking at physical safety and comfort. Safety has probably never been more forefront to the conversation than it is now. But comfort is also something that's really key. And looking at this notion and acknowledging that comfort and competence, for that matter, is contextual. It's something that you really need to look at what's happening in the moment to determine what success looks like. Another key thing here is that comfort really is best viewed as an active state. When you look at the etymology of that word, comfort, it really starts to reveal that the origins of meaning behind it are focused on this idea of to lend strength and support, which is a little bit different than what I think a lot of people may think of when you think of comfort as being something that's more kind of cushy and maybe more sedate. At the psychological level, fundamental needs are a key area of focus here. And this really includes differences in perception, or neurodiversity is kind of the hot word in discourse at the moment. And it's great that it's out there. It's elevating portions of dialogue that have not been incorporated previously. But really what we're looking at here is natural variation in the way that people perceive the world around us. And then lastly, looking at culture. And so this is really getting to that social lens, acknowledging that people experience the world individually as members of groups and representatives of community, and that we can map culture along those dimensions through a series of characteristics. And we can look at those characteristics in terms of where someone sees themselves now versus where they want to be in the future. And that's a good way to start building a plan for a long-term approach to place design, something that can be more incremental and evidence-based, so that you're building a data set that travels along with you as you're implementing plans for the change to the design of places. Here's a foundational piece of research in this category, this coming from our Knoll brand, this idea of holistic ergonomics, really fusing together and I would say expanding beyond a more engineering focus of ergonomics and looking at cognitive and social factors for a more holistic approach. Some of the newer and more forward-looking research in this area is really looking at the topic of neurodiversity. This is a friend and one of our close collaborators, Dr. Sally Augustin. She's a principal with the firm Design with Science, and she's an environmental psychologist by education and practice. And she's quite fond of saying no person is average, and we all bring something unique to our perceptions. Sally hosted a webinar for us not too long ago called Designing for Every User, and we can drop a link in the chat where you can get more access to that as well. Also related to this topic is the idea of neuroaesthetics. Our Muto brand has really been at the forefront of advancing this idea, and this is something that's been done in collaboration with an initiative called the Neuroarts Blueprint that's coming out of a collaboration with Johns Hopkins University and the Aspen Institute. This is, I would say, more than pretty. This is a very exciting initiative that's really looking to codify and document, I would say, what a lot of really great designers do intuitively, but it's helping to quantify the meaning, and these are my words, quantifying the meaning of great design and how design can make people feel, and providing more of an academic and research basis for some of that many of us do intuitively through design practice. So moving on to the second principle, places that matter, strength, and community. Place is more valuable when it facilitates the relationships that help us generate value for our families, our organizations, and the communities in which we live and work. That's how places that matter strengthen community. Our activities connect us to one another, both directly and indirectly. And because place has an inherent ability to support or inhibit what we do within it, we can shape places to strengthen connection by facilitating the activities that bring people together physically, emotionally, purposefully, and otherwise. And trying to anticipate all of the things that people will do can be daunting, if not impossible. However, as I was mentioning earlier, we can group those interactions into two really high-level categories. That notion of actions that are more open-ended for exchanging and reflecting upon ideas, and actions that are more outcome-oriented. So when we start to dive into some of the more specific topic areas within this principle, we're really looking at the activities of specific groups of people. So where principle one is talking about human experience in general, when we move to the second principle of places that matter, strength, and community, we're starting to move from the general to the specific. And so within this, we look at the topic areas of purpose, objectives, social networks, and activities. And so first, looking at purpose, this is really critical to identify early in the process. You want to know what it is that people are striving for collectively as a group. And we can describe purpose as what an individual, group, or community gives to the world and hopes to seek in return. So for example, at MillerKnoll, our purpose statement is designed for the good of humankind. Design, facilitating, helping, advancing that as an action is what we're offering to the world, and what we hope to get in return is real positive impact for the good of humankind. It takes a lot of work to articulate those statements, but it's some of the most important work that you can do with your clients to identify and articulate that early. When we talk about objectives, this is where we are keeping track of common goals and strategic challenges that design can help people achieve. And we think it's important to do that because then that gives us a way to help implement lessons learned, not only from one law firm to another, but across industries. A lot of the work these days is pulling insights from academia and pulling that into workplace, from workplace into healthcare, and really cross-pollinating those learnings under that banner of kind of common objectives that communities are seeking. Social networks. This is some of the most, in my assessment, exciting work that we've got on the books. Really learning more about social structures that form within organizations and how those structures determine what ideas and behaviors reach us and how we interpret them. This is going to be some incredibly useful knowledge, especially as we look to build new types of work experiences and new environments that reflect those. So this work also begins to identify different types of information, whether information is familiar, whether it's novel, or whether it's not even capable of being succinctly articulated just yet. When we look at those different types of information, they move across different social network structures in different ways. So working to build almost a diagnostic tool, if you will, to help organizations understand the shape of their social network structure and whether or not it's in a condition to advance the type of ideas and behaviors that they want to move as an organization based on their strategic objectives at a moment in time. And activities is something that we've been digging into for a number of years, codifying common tasks that people execute in different types of places, looking at a broad range of analog and digital tools that people use. And then lastly, that point on schedule, asynchronous collaboration and communication is something that we are just beginning to scratch the surface on. It has so many huge implications for the way that we connect, where and how we connect, and what sort of expectations we have on each other and the places where we gather. So as an example of some existing research that's really kind of serving as the bedrock for this principle, I've got two field guides on screen here. One developed by Herman Miller, and this was done in collaboration with GitLab, just a really short and sweet field guide on tips for working from home. And then on the right-hand side there, we've got a guide developed by Knoll around building out meeting spaces to support hybrid work, with more of a focus on some of those digital collaboration tools and how to integrate them with the built environment. And we can drop links to both of those resources in the chat. I kind of jumped the gun a little bit out of my excitement in talking about this slide around social networks. But what you're seeing here on the screen is a graphic. And this is work that's being done with another friend and partner, sociologist, Dr. Andreas Hoffbauer. If you want to learn more about this topic from Dr. Hoffbauer, you can tune into the Looking Forward podcast, season 1, episode 8. We can include a link in the chat to that as well. But this is really what you're seeing here on the left with the focused organization, and on the right with the expansive organization, kind of polar extremes of social network structures within organizations. And really that balanced structure in the center is the one that provides, I would say, the most flexibility for moving the broadest range of types of ideas and behaviors. And when we dive into this further, we can look at things like strong and weak ties, or narrow and wide social bridges within organizations. If you look at, for instance, like on the focused organization piece, this single line, one person connected to another person, is this idea of a narrow bridge, versus in the balanced organization, where you can see multiple people in one group have multiple connections to multiple people in other groups. This is a very fascinating dynamic, especially now when we hear dialogue around, on one hand, this, I would say, remote or virtual connection through things like Teams with video chats. We're seeing immediate working teams have stronger connections to those strong ties in their immediate working group, but we have some like counterpoint executive sentiment saying that they feel that culture is receiving is having a bit of a negative hit for this. And the way that I would explain that is, and this is hypothesis, as I mentioned, these were hypotheses to be tested, that at that executive level, they're looking more at the connection from team to team, which is more difficult to do in these types of virtual interactions. This is really a new media for us. We're learning new ways to connect. And at the present moment, the physical environment seems to be one of the best places to allow for that intermixing between groups, to facilitate some of that cultural connection. But again, this is work in progress that we've got laid out for the road ahead. Here's a bit of a window into the MillerKnoll world around how some of that research makes its way into application. And this is one slide of a series of slides that our team with the MillerKnoll Foundation developed, looking at what does the MillerKnoll community look like. So this is just the slice of the Americas, but we've also got a companion slide looking at Europe and Asia as well, wanting to get a sense of where are we physically located? What is that physical body of people made up of, in terms of representation from different brands, different functions? This is very early work looking at for us, looking at how do we begin to map our social network structure as an organization? How do we interact more meaningfully with the communities in which we exist? And so I just wanted to share this as a visual of some of the detailed behind the scenes planning that is really starting to take place when we look at place design at this much more kind of macro level. So the third principle, places that matter feel inclusive and personal. Place is a reflection of people, both the fundamental things that make us all human and the unique things that make us, well, us. This is why places that matter feel inclusive and personal. And the expression of a place should be based upon the unique cultures, communities, and individuals for whom it was designed. Rather than expecting people to conform to uniform typologies of place, places that matter express what is both authentic and aspirational for people. They consider the widest range of human ability and experience through inclusive design while delivering an equitable experience for everyone. And the best way to achieve this is to engage the people who will use a space as part of the design process. So generally speaking, we can see that communities need to socialize, groups need to collaborate, and individuals need to focus. The best support for those interactions can vary from person to person, team to team, and company to company. And so a great way to meet those diverse needs is to include a purposeful variety of settings directly informed by people's needs. So to recap a little bit where we've traveled so far, principle one was really looking at that human experience at a general level by starting with people. Principle two around strengthening community was looking at more of that specific ways that you see what people are trying to achieve. And this third principle is really getting to really making places real. So progressing from general to specific to real. And so this is where we're getting to the fine-tune information that helps you determine exactly what that real environment that people can show up in needs to be doing for those folks. When we look at the detailed topic areas that organize our knowledge around this, we look at inclusive design, approaches to space planning, configurations of settings, and then ultimately furnishings. So again, you can kind of see that general to specific to real progression moving throughout this. Inclusive design is such an important and I would say consequential topic right now. And one of the ways that I like to talk about this is really an evolution beyond universal design, which is amazing. Those principles should absolutely still be incorporated. But what we're doing is we're moving beyond this notion of designing for people to designing with people. And that notion of considering that broad range of differences in perception as natural. And so again, that idea that I mentioned in the beginning that competence is contextual. if you change the context, you change the environment in which people are showing up in, you can open that platform to a broader range of users. Or the inverse can apply. You can inadvertently exclude people from interacting with the community purely based on how the physical space is articulated. Space planning is something that I also think is really interesting, and that I think previously there was a tendency to say you should always be pushing towards this type of plan or this type of environment. Well, that depends. I would say that in most cases, a workplace environment, where you've got perimeter offices that are completely lining the windows of a floor plate, is not going to serve the greatest number of users. But I do think there are some instances where that type of planning approach makes sense. So it's not that these planning approaches are inherently good or bad. What's good or bad is the level of fit for the people that they're intending to serve. So it's all about making sure that you're finding the right planning approach for that organization and being able to present those in a way that allows people to see it's this or it's that. Once you identify that, then looking at the settings or the building blocks that are kind of arranged within that environment, and then lastly, the furnishings that make up those in a very kind of scaled macro to micro approach. So when we look at some of the foundational research that has informed this, this is one of my favorites, Kevin Lynch, The Image of a City. And this is really looking at the ability of an environment to present a cognitive map or an image of an environment that people can remember and think about, not only while they're there, but also when they leave. And this is something that adds in the process of cognition and memory. And within this, there are 5 distinct elements that make up these environments. Those are paths, edges, nodes, landmarks, and districts that kind of work together as a set of modular planning principles that can help guide the ultimate form of a physical environment. This is something that is more current and future looking. The gentleman on screen, John A. Powell, is with the UC Berkeley the UC Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute. We had a great conversation. Actually, Ryan Anderson, our VP of Global Insight and Research, interviewed Mr. Powell and had an in-depth conversation around the role of belonging in society today and the role of belonging in society in the future. It's an incredibly inspiring conversation. We can drop a link to the chat where you can listen to that, which I believe was the Looking Forward podcast, season 1, episode 9. But the specific topic on the screen here, targeted universalism, I think is a very applicable approach to inclusive design. Targeted universalism was developed as an approach for developing public policy, but the principles can apply broadly across almost any kind of design. And it really starts with identifying a universal goal that's based upon broadly shared recognition of a societal problem or collective aspiration, then assessing the general population performance relative to that goal, then looking at identifying groups and places that are performing differently with respect to that goal. And then next, assessing and understanding the structures that support or impede each group or community from achieving the universal goal. And then lastly, developing and implementing targeted strategies for each of those groups to achieve that universal goal. So that crazy zigzag chart that I started with at the very beginning, identifying universal goals at a high level and then giving individual groups or localities multiple pathways to achieve that result is one of the ways that we can approach flexibility in design at a much more macro kind of purpose-driven level. All right, we're getting into the home stretch. The 4th principle, places that matter get better over time. The value we derive from a place fluctuates based on a range of factors, from our emotional connection to it, to its ability to adapt to new uses. Place is never static, but places that matter get better over time. Place is constantly evolving. Whether that evolution is to the benefit or the detriment of the people who use it requires deliberate action. When we create places that matter, we invest time, thought, energy, and emotion, as well as capital in their continuous improvement, granting them the resilience to adapt to new people and patterns of use. A place's ability to improve is largely determined by intentional and strategic investment in its creation. And so here, the word investment doesn't necessarily mean spending a lot of money on new furniture. It can mean dedicating appropriate time to consider what's most important, putting a plan in place for experimentation and learning about new approaches to place, or simply making sure that you're right sizing the monetary spend for the challenge at hand. When we look at the detailed topic areas that roll up under this principle, these are all based on assessing and improving place value over time. So principle 1, general human experience. Principle 2, specific human experience. Principle 3, looking at the real manifestation of those ideas in real environments. And principle 4 is about how those environments really become living entities and evolve over time, or I should say adapt over time along with people. Evolution is not always positive, but we can push adaptation in a more positive direction when we do it intentionally. So when we look at sustainability, this here is really focusing on goals and commitments that we as MillerKnoll have made. So this is work that we can directly influence around advancing sustainability, but that's a topic that should be discussed in every design project. And I would dare say that the vast majority of you on the line are doing that as well in your own firms. We also look at timeless craft and quality as being a key ingredient here. So when we talk about places getting better over time, this can happen in a couple different ways. So it can happen either with that constant adaptation and changing, or getting better over time can happen through permanence, through not changing, through something getting better with age. And so I think about the story that I love to share on this is, if you imagine that your grandmother had a womb chair and you sat in her lap as she told you stories, and she leaves that chair to you and you use it to tell stories to your children and tell them that you heard stories from their grandmother, or whatever, that you start to build some generational memory into that environment. And that's a very real thing for organizations to consider today. Yes, people want extreme levels of flexibility, but if everything is flexible, you're going to have chaos. So it's an important decision point to decide, where's the foundation, where's the flex? Where do we want to have institutional and community memory built into the environment versus where do we want to make sure that it's constantly changing and adapting based on the conditions that we see around us? And that's where we get into this idea of continuous improvement, which is really informed by our decades of experience in lean manufacturing, but now includes a focus on data analytics to help identify opportunity areas in a more forward-looking capacity. And one of the things that we're really seeing start to bubble up here is that working with place-based data is something that is really becoming common practice for not only I hate using this phrase, end user organizations, companies, communities of people, but also design firms alike. This is a new utility, essentially, that we're working to plan with, moving beyond mechanical, electrical, and plumbing to include the data infrastructure within an environment. And how do you use that as an input to drive design forward? And then this last one here around pilot projects, this is one of the primary vehicles that we're seeing today to work with all of this information, creating really bite-sized and manageable projects that help incorporate all of this new input, that help document data and measures of success in a manageable way as organizations gradually build more and more muscle memory around this more active and constantly adapting approach to place than what I would say much of the market and industry has afforded previously. When we look at some of the foundational or And this is a little more current stuff that we have here. Our workplace experience team has been putting together a series of reports on piloting, some guiding best practices that are starting to emerge. And there's a third installment of this work that's coming out very soon that will identify some real world recent examples of pilot projects that were implemented with organizations wanting to test out new types of individual, group, and community experiences within their environments. And then lastly, I was going to close here, and this is really more forward looking. These are the 2030 sustainability goals for MillerKnoll, looking at identifying very specific targets that we're measuring against to meet our commitments from a sustainability standpoint. So I'm going to close this presentation the same way that part one was closed, with a set of three next steps. So I, as promised, shared a very broad field of information. I hope it hasn't been too much and that you at least got some key nuggets in there that you can use. But set all of that aside for a moment. And when we talk about engaging with our clients to move things forward, we've distilled this down into a recommendation of three next steps. The first one is around engaging your people in dialogue about the work experience. That is so critical, not only to get information about what will inform the design, but to engage them in dialogue, to build trust, and to make sure that they feel invested in the solution, so that when that solution doesn't hit the mark 100%, they can come back and offer feedback around what will make it better. Step two is leveraging that feedback in a measurable way, where there's a paper trail, a data trail, if you will, in the implementation of new approaches to workplace. And then third is really channeling that into a new stream of piloting environments to move into that new phase of a more active approach to place design. That's the series of slides. We only have a few minutes left for questions. My apologies. Tried to run through that as quick as possible, but Alan, I am going to come back to you.
Sure. We've got a few questions in the chat. Let's start with Gail's questions. Do these findings change based on market segments? And I'm imagining Gail is thinking, for instance, do these findings change based on, say, financial in New York City, energy in Texas, tech in California, that sort of thing?
There are variations, but what we found is much more interesting are things like some of the more, I'm wanting to use the word social characteristics of the organization more so than their industry. So for instance, what's the age of the organization, you know, from startup to well-established industry leader? Where is that organization showing up? Are they housed in more of a suburban area, a dense urban environment, more rural places? Are they primarily virtual? Those types of characteristics have more of an impact on what the best place will look like than the industry in which an organization operates. Now, of course, there are some like highly specialized spaces, you know, for instance, like if you've got a lab environment or a pharmacy space, those things are, of course, unique from industry to industry. But when it comes to the more behavioral side of place, some of those more social indicators are more important than industry.
Okay, perfect. The next one from Diana is asking, and I think this gets at sort of human needs or well-being, but she's curious how the focus on the current perceptions of human needs impact the 88 guidelines that were created decades ago, for example, with collaboration areas and high stand-up tables.
I very much view the ADA guidelines, the Universal Design Guidelines, as kind of like a foundation of table stakes. And the things that I was sharing today are really going beyond that. So they are intended to supplement, not supplant that information. And one of the things that I would say here is that when you approach design from a more inclusive standpoint, it's really about collecting feedback from those specific users to inform the design of that place. And so I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a greater variety of physical manifestations of environments that are true reflections of the people that are actually using it on a day-to-day basis.
Wonderful. We have several questions about access to the content, and I know that Evelyn has been sharing multiple links in chat, but some specifics. Can we get those reports on Omni for the group? Omni is an internal site for us. Can you share the link to the pilot programs from the workplace experience team? Can you share out the sustainability information? So, what I'm wondering, and you tell me, Joseph, is because I think some of these questions are coming from designers like Genevieve Carmona, old friend of mine, Edward Woodhill, who's with one of our dealers. Is the best thing for this type of information for them to reach out to their MillerKnoll representative for copies of this? Or
Yes.
is it all available in a centralized location online?
I just dropped a link in the chat to the sustainability targets that I mentioned.
Okay.
And unfortunately, the information on pilot projects, this is stuff that is emerging so rapidly that it is not hosted publicly online just yet. But if you connect with your local rep, they can link you up with our workplace experience team, which has been the primary author of that information in particular. So we tried to include a broad range of links in the chat along the way. But if there was something that's specific that you're looking for that was not in there, go through your local representative. And I will say that a lot of this is, there's a change in how we've engaged with our information, our knowledge in the past, and how we're going to in the future. This was really intended to be an opening of the doors, if you will, where we intend to broadcast much more of that going forward. If you have a specific and immediate need, please reach out and we will do whatever we can to get that information in your hands.
Perfect. And so, I think we're about at time. There are no further questions, but a lot of comments, very informative, great job, wonderful presentation, so very insightful. So thank you, Joseph, for sharing part 2 of Designing a Better Tomorrow, and thank you to our audience for dialing into this. We look forward to seeing everyone on our next Design Perspective series in February. We'll actually have a brand new MillerKnoll CEU to share with all of you. Our head archivist will be sharing our first MillerKnoll CEU entitled Leading Modernism. So please look for an invitation for that. And thank you again to the audience. And Joseph, as always, thank you to you.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll see you all soon. Bye.